I'm honored to kick off our first panel discussion of the day, which asks a deceptively simple question. What exactly do employees want? What do workers want? How do employers adopt a worker-first culture? As mentioned earlier, it's obvious that the past 2 years dramatically shifted the answer to this question. Before the pandemic, before any of us ever thought we'd hear the word lockdown as frequently as we have, many of us were utterly consumed by our work. But now, being passionate about your job isn't necessarily a bad thing, but hustle culture has its costs. As an employer, you want high performance, and to get it, today more than ever, you need to be attuned and responsive, as Barbara said, to your employees' workplace needs. And it goes without saying, as new cohorts enter the workforce in ever-rising numbers, the needs today are not yesterday's. An often neglected aspect of this is employee mental health. Many employers realize coming out of the pandemic just how critical a role good mental health plays in organizational success. This focus on employee well-being is thankfully becoming more prevalent. For decades, we have expected strong soft skills from workers. These days, with skills shortages in every sector of the economy, it is very much a seller's market. So we need to flip the question: how can successful employers show higher emotional intelligence towards their staff and hiring candidates? Before we continue, I invite you all to answer our poll. For those joining us virtually, you can access the poll by clicking on the Q&A and polling tab on your screen. For those of you joining in person, instructions on how to answer the poll are on the table. The poll asks, in the near term, as employees return to the office, what do you think will be their top priority? And I'll be sharing the results at the end of the session. While you're doing that, allow me to introduce our panel moderator, John Wright, Executive Vice President of Meru Public Opinion. John has been conducting consumer citizen survey research for clients in every sector for over 3 decades. He's a pioneer in conducting global research with projects in over 30 countries. John is also a distinguished fellow at Queen's University School of Policy Studies. Please welcome John onto our stage.
It's great to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Good morning, and thank you, Giles. As we emerge from this pandemic, if that's where we are today, the work you're doing on the Blueprint Institute is going to be very, very important in making sure that we have a collective path forward for the corridor, the innovation corridor. And what's interesting about the work you're doing is that it covers off more than just innovation, about housing and commuting and all of that sort of areas that affect our workplace. I just wanted to simply say that my last function, and I'm sure everybody's got this story, but my last function was on Friday, February the 13th of 2020, where I was presenting at the Empire Club with the industry representing long-term care. So I welcome the opportunity to be back here and to be in a very positive place so that we can move ahead. And I thank the staff, applaud them very much for putting together a very seamless speaker process, and I'm sure by the end of the day we'll thank them as well for the rest of this day. So for most of you here, it probably is the first time in 2 years that you've gathered with other business leaders in person like this. It's incredible to think what has happened since then and how the landscape has changed in so many ways. I remember a survey I did in 1998 for the World Bank that said that only 4% of people were telecommuting. We can remember that phrase. I was speaking with a prominent business leader, this is true, from the region on the weekend, and she seemed to sum it up best when she said, quote, "All of the ingredients are there to mix, except there is no HR or leadership cookbook to follow. We are literally starting from scratch, and that goes for managers and employees alike." She was a executive vice president of a very large company that delivers things every day to our house or our work. She was thinking of a new hire who, despite having worked at their organization for 8 months, had only known colleagues through Teams or Zoom. That hire was now meeting colleagues in person for the first time last week. We wondered what must have gone through their mind as they walked through the underground path to their office, passing closed amenities and vacant stores. Were they apprehensive about what that first week or weeks would look like in the office? How would they connect to people? How would they actually discuss things with them when all they'd done is virtually connect? And then she paused and said, for so many of these new and returning employees, we will never again get a second chance to make a first impression, to a fresh start over the next few months. She was also thinking of direct reports who had suffered immense personal challenges over the course of the pandemic, including the loss of loved ones. I know 3 or 4 people who suffered that. And trying to speak about that in the workplace and trying to approach that is a very difficult subject. These were the kind of people for whom a return to normal might induce extra anxiety in how they connect with their colleagues and how those colleagues would know how to address each other. She was thinking out loud, trying to anticipate the supports that might be needed beyond the tried and true HR playbook that had been used for so long and now seemed in need of a real refresh, if not a total rewrite for the time being. And most importantly, whether those employees were either full-time at the office, full-time or hybrid posted to home, or newly hired in this new job, or even a new experience for that role. Their first job, she was wondering aloud, what supports and needs all of those in her workplace may need over the months ahead as they all adjusted to whatever a new normal would require, or whatever that meant. I suspect that most in our audience today and online are thinking about those things and also experiencing them in many ways. I joined Maru, in fact, during the pandemic. We operate on 4 continents. I've probably interacted with 25 people out of 400. It's been a remarkable experience. I have an office in New York I'll probably not see for some time. But I suspect all of that is a very personal relationship, and we're really grateful to have some people for our panel today who are going to talk about their perspectives and bring that cookbook together in many ways. We have, and I'd like them to come up as I call them, Dominic Cole-Morgan, Senior Vice President of Total Rewards at Scotiabank. Dominic just flew in from London last night. I don't think he slept. I think he's... Yeah, and so we're very happy he's here. Kim Vander Aerschot, partner at Financial Services Consulting at PwC. Then we have Joseph Mancinelli, International Vice President and Regional Manager of Central and Eastern Canada at Liuna. And finally, we have Dr. Susan Black, CEO at the Conference Board of Canada. We're going to eschew with the biogs this morning. I'm sure you can search them out, but they're all distinguished people so that we can get right into this piece. And I for each of us who are here today, and I want to go through to each one of the panelists with my opening question, because we can jump right in and maybe we can start. Kim, we can start with you. So, what have you seen as the key shift in the dynamic between employees and employers through this pandemic? And in your view, what are employees seeking in this new environment?
Thank you, John, and hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I think the opening comments certainly covered a lot of ground and gave us a lot of food for thought. And so I guess I would say that one of the key themes that was touched upon was the fact that there's clearly a war for talent, and that has really shifted the dynamics between employers and employees and given employees more weight. Certainly, as we all know, the pandemic has been a health crisis, but in many ways also an existential crisis for people, and have really caused them to reevaluate what's important in their lives. And having a taste of the ability to work remotely and do things very differently has also opened the eyes of everyone in terms of that it's possible to do things differently and to really evaluate how you can accommodate work and life and one's individual priorities. So in terms of what that means, certainly compensation and being competitive and fair has been a huge topic of discussion. But once we go past that, there's many things that are important. But if I had to pick three in the interest of brevity, I would say clearly flexibility is key. It's employees are demanding flexibility and will not return to how work was done pre-pandemic. And we're actually seeing that as we get closer, as the pandemic progresses, that workers have more conviction around that as time goes by. So I think some of the research shows that, for a poll that was done last summer, for example, versus a similar question that was asked more recently in March, if your employer demanded that you go back or mandated that you return to the office, we're seeing more employees who would maybe return, about a third, but would immediately start looking for a new job. And a quarter of them would just simply quit and look for another job immediately. So there's definitely more demand and conviction around the importance of flexibility. The second would be around well-being and the importance of focusing on well-being. And then the third is really in terms of good work. So the importance of having meaningful work, where they are valued for their skills and their contributions. But with that also comes obviously an opportunity for progression and career development. And I think some of the opening comments obviously alluded to the importance of upskilling and investing in people, and that's all linked to that.
Thanks. Susan?
Well, I'm going to echo a lot of what we've already...
Maybe pass the mic.
Okay, or am I? Oh, it's on now. Thank you.
Okay, sorry.
No, thank you, and I'm delighted to be here this morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm going to echo a lot of what Kim has said and what we've heard from our speakers already. The first thing I would say is this is a permanent sea change in the relationship between employers and employees. For many years, I worked in the area of diversity and inclusion, particularly around gender issues. And one of the big barriers for women was flexibility. Organizations were, despite best efforts, still reluctant to give flexibility. And there were two big reasons. There was an underlying current, a deep belief that if I don't see you in the office, you aren't working. And if I don't see you in the office, you're not really committed. Well, we have just proven over 2 years that that is absolutely unequivocally false. So forget the debate. There's no more debate. You can't talk about it anymore. So that raises expectations for everyone. So as Kim said, for office workers, there is an expectation now that there is some kind of flexibility that allows you to do your work where you want, basically. There's been a fair amount of research. Kim alluded to some. We did some research in partnership with Carleton University that showed if you were in a hybrid or if you were remote worked for the last 2 years, you want to do that going forward. It also showed actually if you were working in real life, in person, you wanted to do more of that. But these things aren't changing. What does that mean for employees? They do want more flexibility. The second thing I would say is this is a hugely traumatic event societally, globally for all of us. And I think we all know as individuals, when you have a traumatic event in your personal life, you lose a loved one, you have a serious health crisis, what do we all normally do? We revisit how we want to live our life. So I think this is part of what is happening now, and that means there's an expectation from employees that organizations will live their values. It's not simply going to be a communications exercise anymore. If you look at the history of management thought, we go through these phases of, it used to be, let's look at our vision, let's talk about our mission. Now it's our purpose, but to me it feels qualitatively different. I think this purpose discussion is very real and very profound for people. So they have expectations that way. The last thing I would say is really more about how managers treat employees. It is not easy to manage people virtually. It's not as simple as walking over to their cubicle and checking in. It requires a manager to be much more intentional. It requires our systems to be ever crisper and clearer and performance driven. And I think there are going to be there's an increasing challenge and a bar rising for managers overall to be able to do this on an ongoing basis. The last comment I would say on that relates to inclusion, and we've heard some comments on that today. If you're managing in a hybrid workplace, that means some people are coming in, some people aren't. The risk of having people who don't come in as often or who aren't as easily accessible they run the risk of not being viewed as favorably also. So I think there are going to be some new challenges, excuse me, coming out of this for managers and for organizations if they're going to meet these new employee needs. So.
Well, I have to say, first of all, there has never been a more interesting and challenging time to work in HR. I mean, I've been in HR a long time, and this has been the most exciting and difficult couple of years in my career. I think what we're seeing is a fragmenting of the employee relationship, which is putting a strain on that employee relationship. And Barb mentioned this in her opening remarks, and it's something we've been grappling with at the Scotiabank, is because there's no sort of one size fits all. The same day, same place model has completely gone, and we'll never go back to that. And actually, frankly, I prefer it myself. I think the problem we've got is how do we now accommodate multiple different preferences? For example, it works for me to start early, then I get a couple of hours for childcare or as elder care, and every employee, we have 98,000 employees, probably has a different way of wanting to work. So the challenge for the employer is how are we to respond to that in a way that doesn't actually make an always-on culture even worse. So for example, if people are sending emails at 6 in the morning because that works for them, how do we create a culture where people don't feel obligated to respond at 6 in the morning and are fine to go, do you know what, I'm not starting till 9, I'm going to respond then, or if it's late at night. So there is an interesting dynamic we're going to have to grapple with in HR, but also as employers, which is in relation to how do we accommodate multiple different ways of preferences of working, and how do we ensure that people, the good side of that, which is people are able to provide that flexibility for their own lives, doesn't come at the expense of everybody else or you're the recipients, especially if it's a manager report relationship, the receiver thinking, oh, okay, I've received this, I need to now respond. And that is something we're quite concerned with. However, I think it does, as a couple of my colleagues have said, it opens up huge opportunities for us as employers. I mean, the opportunities around D&I excite me enormously, especially around people with disabilities, Indigenous. I think the gender angle is extremely important as well, with people being able to accommodate childcare. So I think we squander this opportunity at our peril. Employees want flexibility. We need to find a way to meet that flexibility, but in a way that we are still able to communicate the culture of the organisation and what it means to work for an organisation. And that's something that does concern me. I have members of my team who've joined and now left who I've never met. And I don't know whether meeting me would have made them stay. Maybe the opposite, to be honest. But there is something about how do we communicate the culture of the organisation and engage employees such that it doesn't become a very transactional relationship of I'm going to come and work for you and then I'm going to leave. Because there's a huge cost to the employer of turnover. So for us, it's around how do we shift the culture of the organisation to embrace the flexibility, to communicate what's important for the organisation for employees who you may not see very frequently, and to engage them such that actually they feel part of Scotiabank or whatever the employer is, and then have long, meaningful careers with us. So there's a lot of interesting topics, but I have to say, I'll reiterate, I think there's never been a more exciting time to work in HR.
Thanks, Dominic. Joseph?
Well, pleasure to be here with you. This is my very first non-virtual conference, and it's a pleasure to be wearing pants for a change. I am in a unique situation because I do not represent the employers, I represent the employees. I represent 150,000 construction workers, and we have been in a very unique situation because we worked right through the pandemic. We didn't lose any hours during the pandemic, and in fact, because of the severe skill shortages that we have in the skilled trades, we worked even harder during the pandemic as well. But there have been some interesting things that have developed in the construction industry, primarily when it comes to health and safety. The pandemic has forced our employers and our workers and the employees to look at health and safety at a very different, in a very different perspective. In fact, we had the lowest rates of infection anywhere And there are many reasons for that. Some of it because most of our workers work outside, so that did help throughout the pandemic, but also because the protocols that were in place were effective. We worked very closely with the provincial government, with a Minister of Labor who did an exceptional job and continues to do an exceptional job, Monty McNaughton, which you'll hear from later, and I'm not going to steal his thunder, but a number of protocols were put in place in the construction industry that changed the way employees came to work. If you would have told construction workers 4 years ago that they would have had to wear masks and wash their hands and follow a number of protocols, especially in a very macho, machismo industry, it would have been very difficult. But the pandemic changed the way that happened. In fact, our employers and our workers embraced the protocols, and we had the lowest rate of infection of any industry, which we're very proud of, and continued to work with very, very few losses of labor throughout the pandemic. One of the things, though, that we saw an increase of, which is not related to the construction industry, but one that we've heard time and time again, is mental health. And throughout the pandemic, this 150,000 construction workers have families. And so the multiple effect of the pandemic on children and on students and on their spouses was pretty profound. And so our benefit plans and our employers had to look at mental health in a very different way, improve programs for our members and our workers to ensure that they had vehicles in place in order to, and help in place because of what they were feeling and what their families were feeling. So the pandemic did have a number of effects on our employers. And of course, a lot of those health and safety measures are going to stay in place. And so, a number of construction sites prior to the pandemic did not have a lot of sanitary conditions. And there's a cost, obviously, associated with doing that. But during the pandemic, those are habits now that are going to stay. And I think that's going to change the way workers are going to feel at work. Bringing new people into the industry, it's important also to maintain those health and safety measures. If we're talking, as Giles mentioned earlier, bringing new people, Indigenous people, women into the workforce, then we're going to have to change the way we do things. And the construction industry is one of those industries that is the most challenging in order to bring women, bring Indigenous folks and youth into the industry. And so the pandemic has showed us, especially with the severe shortages, that we've got a lot of work to do.
I wanted to demonstrate to Joseph that I understand firsthand. Our eldest son is a carpenter, unionized carpenter.
There you go.
And they were lucky enough in some ways they had the contract to do all the renovations at Walmart. So they were busy from the very outset. I want to come to Kim first and then go to Dominic. There's a real practicality moving forward in the next 60 days. When I talked to the executive leader, she reminded me that when they were leaving medical parts in people, unfortunately, in the operating room, they brought in pilots to go through checklists and start to make sure that there was a protocol in that. And I guess with the leeway of not knowing what the next 60 days is really looking like for all, any thoughts on what we should either anticipate or deal with, going forward into the workplace?
Yeah, of course. So Joseph, I would like to thank you for two things. One, for wearing pants, and and number two, also for reminding us that not everybody is returning to the office, because there was many across industries that never left the so-called office, right? So it's really with a lot of privilege that we make a lot of this commentary around returning to the workplace or the office. Certainly, I think we use the term hybrid, and I think that universally seems to be one of the major models that will be adopted going forward. But it's kind of become jargon, because it really, when you ask different employers what that really looks like, it's defined quite differently by everyone. So I think it's really important that we understand what that looks like. And I guess the other part of it is employers are grappling with, how do we get people back in? Do we mandate them to come back in? Or do we try to create some sort of momentum and draw people into the office? And I think maybe last fall, when we thought we were going to be returning, there was more of the voluntary focus, but I feel there's a momentum towards making it more mandatory, because it's hard to break 2 years of habits in a short while. So the question is really, do we make it mandatory, or do we still make it voluntary? At what speed do we return them, and how much flexibility do we offer? At PwC, we've certainly chosen not to make it mandatory for the time being, and we're completely making it voluntary. So what that means, though, is it places the onus on leaders for a lot of things, in terms of looking at ways of working, and leaders obviously cast tall shadows and are the individuals that our employees look to, and really bring to life what that experience is supposed to be like. So there's a lot of pressure on leaders, again, as has been throughout the pandemic, to really be modeling the right behaviors and bringing whatever that model is defined at your organization, really bringing that to life in a consistent and meaningful way. Of course, we've already touched on inclusive practices. I think as we go back to, or return to the workplace, or return to a hybrid, or really put in place the hybrid model for the first time, that it's being tested at scale, it's easy to default to in-person interactions, because we're social beings. So often meetings, your attention will gravitate to people in the room, which again puts at risk, that sense of inclusion and belonging for those individuals that are not physically in the room. And we know, as Susan touched on before, that pre-pandemic there was a career penalty for individuals who had more flexible arrangements, and typically we're left out of opportunities and opportunities for progression and advancement. So as leaders, we need to be very careful and mindful of how we're showing up, and making sure that we're not just thinking about the people in the room, but also those people on our teams that are working remotely. And then lastly, of course, because this is the first time we're really putting this hybrid model to the test, I think it's really important that we listen and seek feedback very intentionally and learn, because I don't think anyone has figured this out, because we haven't lived it. So I think we need to be open to adjusting and changing and figuring out what really works for our people and for us as an employer, because obviously we have businesses to run too.
Thanks, Kim. Dominic?
Thank you. No, I'm fantastic. I want to echo a lot of the points that Kim just made. I mean, for me, the next 60 days really are a series of test and learns, and then good two-way communication. So we've introduced at Scotiabank a concept of we care, you decide. And we care is, we care that this is done in person. It'd be something like a development conversation or onboarding. And the rest of it, you decide where you want to work best. If that's in the office, that's great. If that's at home, then that's great as well. But we've kept that intentionally quite limited at the beginning in relation to sort of the we care. And we can always build on that. So for us, there's a bit of a start slow. And we start slow to recognize that our employees, and I can speak for my own team, are nervous about coming back to the office. They're nervous about the health protocols. They're nervous about the commute. They're nervous about actually losing the flexibility they've got from working from home and the way they've been able to accommodate their home and work lives. And I think we just have to recognize that nervousness and understand what is behind it, and to be able to demonstrate some small successes as well. So where we had a hybrid meeting last week, I was hybrid because I was actually in the UK, but some people were in the office, and we beamed into the office and we asked people to talk about what their experience was like. And that was a little bit about reassuring team members that being in the office was a positive experience, because we've all been out of the office for so long. It's become a bit of a bogeyman. There's a big frightening thing about going back into the office. And part of that was to talk around what the health protocols we've got, the cleaning protocols. We even talked about the HVAC. So it was to try and dispel some myths, but also to recognize that everyone's on an individual journey, and some people are going to come back delighted and others are going to take a little more reassurance. So initially it's very much around the employee setting the pace. We want you to come in, pick what your first day is going to be, pick what your first we care activity is you want to do in person, and come in. And if it's not for the full day, that is absolutely fine. Take it easy. Come in. Do if your commute is a problem, then commute later. Come in for that meeting. Go home early. Carry on working if that's what's going to happen at home. So for me, it's really is a case of a series of test and learns and good two-way communication. And then actually, I think reassuring employees that we will continue to review the health protocols. We've had a good phrase we've used, I'm sure it's not exclusive to Scotiabank, which was data, not date driven. Every company that said, we're coming back on the 19th of September, you could guarantee something would happen the week before, wasn't going to happen. So we've always taken this data rather than date driven, and that will continue to apply because we could actually go into another wave of COVID, we don't know. So I think it's reassuring employees that we're going to be responsive, that actually if things change, we will roll this back and we'll slow it down. But that they initially do this at their own pace. And I'm actually quite confident that most employees will find a level where they are wanting to spend some time in the office with their colleagues, because that's where those soft bonds, those conversations, that your development happens in a way that it is more challenging in a remote way. So I think by keeping it very the employee driven, conscious that and communicate that we are aware that the circumstance can change and we may need to roll it back, but also demonstrating the success, I think is the key for us, to be honest. But it's going to be slow and steady, and I think we have to just be aware that we could all be in 3 weeks' time in a very different place if something else happens, and just communicating that to employees. They feel they're part of the discussion and decision as well.
Thanks, Dominic. Joseph, you actually are in an interesting position because your industry was full-time from the outset. And so you've gone through a lot of the experiences from day one that many others have missed. And there's some sectors who will do better than others in this. But I'm curious, when you were going through those phases, and even where you are today, where we might even be expecting another wave of the pandemic, who knows? What are some of the experiences that you had in terms of, or your industry had in terms of dealing with that employee-employer dynamic and the relationships that was there, like that whole phase-in period and how you adjusted to? What are some of the learnings you got out of that?
Well, at the very beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of anxiety, as you can imagine, because there's a lot of construction that's already on the go. Construction doesn't just start. I mean, there's tons of it that's already been underway, and a number of these projects are multi-year projects. So there's a lot of anxiety on whether or not these projects were going to stop. And so our employers were lobbying our government to ensure that, in fact, a number of these projects would continue. And the workers, our members, were doing the exact same thing with a hope that they could continue to work. So in the beginning, there was just a very, very high level of anxiety, but it evaporated fairly quickly. There was extraordinary communication between our employers, our workers, the building trade unions, and the government. And I think that collaboration went a long, long way in order to make sure that in fact the industry continued to work. The implementation of a number of the health and safety measures also created some anxiety, as you can imagine. There were costs associated to some of these measures, and some of these work sites may have had 800 people working on a project. So this was not just a few masks. This was a big undertaking to make sure that you had the proper PPE in place and sanitized hand washing equipment, etc. So a lot of anxiety over that. But that got quickly resolved as well. Again, communication was key to make sure that these measures were put in place in a timely manner. because the economics were at play. We didn't want to shut any jobs down, and we had no choice in the construction industry. We don't have choices. We can't pour concrete virtually. Everything has to be done there. And in fact, I commend the comments that are being made. I think the measures that you're taking are admirable. I'm really glad that our construction workers aren't here to hear about it, because that would change the industry completely, and I'm not so sure that our contractors would be happy about that. But it's a very unique industry that had very unique experiences, you can imagine.
Susan, there are some organizations that have gone actually completely virtual. What a remarkable situation. What are some of the things that you have to watch for, or the challenges that those employees and employers are going to have to deal with?
Well, why don't I tell you the story of the conference board, because we made the decision to go completely virtual, meaning not hybrid, no office to go back to. So I'll set the context by sharing why we did that. I'll tell you how we did it, and I'll tell you what the outcomes are as of today. So the conference board, headquartered in Ottawa, we actually owned our office building, 45,000 square foot office building in Ottawa at the beginning of the pandemic. It was an old office building. It was going to need some work, no matter what was happening. And most importantly, it wasn't configured for the kind of culture we were trying to build, a collaborative culture where groups came together, did terrific research. It was a maze of little warrens. So building wasn't fantastic. The kind of work we do lends itself well to being at a computer screen and talking to people on the phone. We also have an employee base that would self-identify as introverts. And when we polled them early in the pandemic, 50% said, we never ever want to come back to an office again. It's like, okay. And the other 40% said a day or two a week. So these things are all happening early on, and we decided, let's take the bold move, let's sell the building, let's double down on being the best possible virtual first organization we can be. From a management standpoint, that meant we weren't spending our time trying to figure out how are we going to fix the HVAC in this place, and how are we going to put arrows on the floor, and how are we going to schedule people coming back in. We said we're going to take our bandwidth, our resources, our money, our people, and we're going to double down here. So how did we do it? We did three things. Number one, we over-indexed on communication. You just heard Joseph talk about the importance of that in his sector. We really placed an enormous emphasis. So you all recall the WHO came out on the Wednesday and said, we now have a global pandemic. Most of us started shutting down Thursday and Friday. We shut down Thursday afternoon. The Monday morning, we had our first all-staff huddle at 9:30. It ran for 15, 20 minutes. We had that huddle every single day for the next 3.5, 4 months. Every single day we put on a huddle for all staff. We then, based on employee feedback, dropped it to 2 or 3 days. We do it once a week now, but we've got a number of other all-staff activities virtually every month to keep that communication going. We also hired a full-time internal communications manager. We are 175 people. For those of you that run SMEs in this organization, like that's a big luxury to have someone who does nothing but focuses on employee communication. We have an external communications department. One of my colleagues is with us today. This was completely separate. So over-indexing on communication. Second thing, because we saw this as a big change management challenge, we involved employees. We gave them a stake. We teed up 6 task forces. We had one on culture. We had one on IT. We had one on work from home policies. We said to the employees, to our colleagues, anybody, you can join any task force you want. It's open to everyone. Let's put our best minds together. Took them 3 or 4 months, 87 recommendations. We probably implemented about half right away. And we explained for the ones that we didn't implement, why not, or why was it being deferred. So that was the second thing. The second thing we did. The final thing we did is we looked very hard at our employee value proposition. And we made a number of changes there to really communicate, and I think this goes back to what you were saying, Kim, how important our employees were to us, and to what you said, we care a lot. So we This also is serendipitous for the organization. It allowed us to do things that moved us from being a sort of a time or tenure-based culture to a performance-based culture. So we did things like everybody got 4 weeks of vacation when you walked through the door. We were the kind of place where you earned it over tenure. One of the biggest things we did is we had a group RSP. We decided we wanted to put more money in there. We wanted to give, I think we heard Barb say, financial security is one of the things you care about. We joined the CAT plan, CAAT, some of you probably know it, and we now offer a DB. That's essentially a DB to employees. So that was huge for us. So we did a number of things that really intentionally communicated to our employees. We care a lot, and we sought a lot of feedback along the way. So what's the outcome? For us, this has been a very successful move. So I'll give you a couple of examples. We, like many of you, I'm sure, do an employee engagement survey. We did one right before the pandemic landed. It was early winter 2 years ago. We did it with a big global firm, well known to people in this room, I'm sure. We just redid it in January. And we reported out on the results to our staff on Monday. When the consultant came in to give us the debrief, one of the things they said is in North America, engagement scores in their pool, their database, have gone down like this. Ours were 20% higher than they were 2 years ago. So that was, they're still a work in progress. I still want them higher, but at least, as we all know around engagement, trending in the right way. The other huge and unanticipated benefit for us was the shift in our talent pool. Before the pandemic, 90% of our employees were in Ottawa, and they're all great. Today, it's under 50%. We are hiring truly across the country. We have about 30 people in Toronto now. We have 8 to 10 in Montreal, 8 to 10 in Calgary. We have someone in the Northwest Territories, Medicine Hat, Halifax. The caliber of talent we have been able to bring in is quite staggering to us. And we have the same challenges around the Great Resignation that I'm sure everybody here does. Keeping people is an ongoing challenge. But bright, smart people want to work with other bright, smart people, and we lock arms together. So it's been very positive on balance. I'll make 2 final comments. The first is, even though it's been positive, it's been very hard, and it's not for everyone. There are some people who really, I think, need to be in a hybrid environment or need to be working day to day with colleagues, and that's okay. It's what is your preference, what is your need. So we've had those experiences with people who either don't want to join or perhaps have left us because that's a better fit for them, and I say God bless. The second thing I would say, and it's been mentioned a couple of times, is there are clearly mental health larger burdens on all of us now. We need to be more mindful of that. So again, we've done, and we continue to do what we can do around that. So we increased our mental health para-medical benefit and so on, but it is hard work, and so we are ever mindful of that. So.
Well, and Susan, I want to pick up on that, and I'm mindful of our clock because this panel is so great, we could just go on for another hour or so. And to those people who have sent questions in, because I'm watching them flow in here on the right-hand side, that I think some of the questions have been answered, but we'll give them over to the organizers and probably fit some of them in to the next period of time. So, but I'm mindful of our time here, and I want to have maybe each one of you reflect on the final piece, and that was, Susan, where you can expand a little bit further, and we can all watch the clock. What do we keep an eye on? I mean, it's interesting that it wasn't until about 1919 or 1920 that we had PTSD present itself for the first time, and they had psychiatrists for the first time dealing with it. In fact, people who were mediums, who did seances, came about the first time because they were trying to connect with those who they'd lost on the battlefield and couldn't find. That's Mackenzie King. It was the thing to do at the time. What are some of these things that we should be watching for, or any thoughts on mental health in the first couple of months?
I'll kick off. So that is one of the things I, as a CEO, am watching for, my colleagues are watching for. Again, it's harder now because you can't see people physically in the workplace if you're in our situation, and you may not see them as much as if you're in hybrid. So, we've gone through training with mental health. As I said, we've increased benefits. We actually have 2 pieces of research underway at the conference board explicitly on mental health. One is, what are the hotspots where our organizations putting their benefits, what are the programs, and what is the ROI on it? And the other one is looking at absenteeism and the connections to mental health. So we're doing our own research to try and get to the core of what those pressing issues are. But I think we know the costs of mental health are enormous, right? It's billions of dollars in this country. It's something like 50 billion overall, and 6 billion related to absenteeism. We think this is not going to dissipate over the coming years because, as we've heard here, we don't really know how to do hybrid or how to do virtual first long term. There's going to be a lot of test and learn, and that puts stresses on people. So I would say watching for mental health issues and helping your employees, your colleagues, your coworkers be in a good place is really key.
We've been on a very similar journey. I'll keep it brief because I'm conscious of time, but we three things. One was we trained our line managers, so it was a bit of a I suppose first aid in terms of how to recognize mental health in issues in their employees, especially in the virtual and hybrid environment. We did expand our mental health coverage quite substantially, but attached to that, we then made sure that the route to market was much clearer, because what happens is if someone's having a bit of a crisis, then they're like, they have to think through, I need that CBT over there. We made it much more sort of diagnostic. Are you having problems sleeping? Have you got anxiety? And then we would present what the potential solutions were. And then we extended as much as possible to family members, because it's not just your own mental health that impacts your work, it's actually if you've got your child or your spouse. So we expanded our coverage as much as we could to cover children, spouses, and some of our benefits, even parents as well. Because we realized people are an ecosystem, their mental health is impacted by their family's mental health, and therefore we needed to think about that more holistic as well, so we expanded our benefits there.
Yeah, and similarly, building just on what Dominic and Susan have highlighted, often their employees aren't aware of the benefits that are available to them and don't know how to access them, to your point, Dominic. So we've spent quite a bit of time at PwC doing a lot of storytelling and destigmatizing sort of the use of some of those benefits, and to demonstrate that this impacts people at all levels, and that it doesn't have to be detrimental to your career if you take a break for a couple of months because you need that for whatever reason it might be, and also having employees share their experiences and talk a lot about what you do outside of work, what you do to maintain your well-being. And we often see employees really stepping up and wanting to celebrate what each other does, so that it becomes part of the dialogue and it becomes acceptable.
So we have spend an extraordinary amount of time on mental health. The construction industry has another unique problem, and that is, a lot of soft tissue injuries that happen, and then of course, opioids has been a really big issue in skilled trades, and that leads to enormous mental health issues. So we have dedicated a lot of resources in our benefit plans, but also on the philanthropic side. We've given millions of dollars to emergency health and mental health as well through a number of the institutions right across the country, because we realize that this is a big problem that needs to be tackled right across the country.
I want to congratulate the panel. We were 37 seconds until our mark. And that's pretty good for our first panel back from the pandemic. I will keep it that way, so rather than going through a long summary, I'm just going to give you 4 words, and you can rearrange them, but there'll be F, H, C, and I. Flexibility, huddle, I thought that was great, communicate, and innovate. And I think that's what I took from this first panel. So thank you to all 4 of you, and especially Dominic for flying in overnight and working through the jet lag. And thanks for, again, coming to a spectacular day organized by the Board of Trade. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to an outstanding panel, as John said, for bringing such an engaging discussion and valuable insights to really this transformed post-COVID workplace. A permanent sea change as in the relationship between employers and employees, as Susan said, and an exciting landscape to navigate for HR professionals, as Dominic pointed out. So, John, first of all, I want to just thank you as you've left the stage for kicking us off and sharing your perspectives. Your data-driven approach helped give us real concreteness to the conversation that we really needed. Dominic, Kim, Joseph, and Susan, terrific to have you here. And you all brought different perspectives to the conversation, really managing today's post-COVID workplace. So, just before we have a 5-minute break, two things. One, I would like to see how people responded to our audience poll, especially considering the conversation we just had. So let's pull up those results. Well, it's pretty, I think that pretty much tells the story right there. Uniformity of view.